What up, everybody? My name is Jędrek, and I'm here today to talk to you about the state of Modern, as you can see on the screen. This will be my weekly video series that I will make for my Patreon, that you can learn all about in the description. There will be a link, and I will be going over what's happening in the format. I will be going over the most popular decks in these videos, about what I would play in any given environment, and about other decks that I used to play and how I would change them to adapt to this given format. Okay, so for those of you who already are on my Patreon, you are probably familiar with my two groups of decks that I like to focus on. The first one is top tier, which is usually not more than 3 decks that are the most common in Modern at any given moment. It's not always the best decks, but the most common decks that you have to be ready for if you want to win an Modern tournament. Then the other group is regulars, which is basically like a tier 2 situation, which are the decks that are quite popular, not as popular as top tier, but you are not surprised to face them. And obviously, there are a lot of decks that are very popular in Modern, but usually for the sake of somewhat short videos and short articles, I tend to choose around 5 or maybe 6 decks, depending on the format, to cover. Okay, so without any further ado, let's jump onto the top tier. And obviously the first deck in our top tier is 4-color Omnath, which is the menace of Modern for almost, I don't know, 4 months now, something along those lines. So Omnath is essentially, as you all know, a mid-range deck that's very, very powerful, and it uses the all different slew of mythic cards from recent expansions, both standard and non-standard. And it's very hard to hide out via any given card. So my biggest advice to everyone who's trying to beat Omnath with blue decks is to try and play somewhat of a flash game against them, because they are focused on playing this mid-range Haymaker style magic when they are tapping out for 4 or 5 mana threats most of the time. So leveraging the tempo advantage via Remand, via Mana Leak, and different cheap interaction is very, very effective versus them, and then you can get some card advantage via playing on their end step if they don't play their big spell, like via Archmage Charm mostly. 4-color Omnath is one of the biggest reasons why I like Archmage's Charm in the format so much. Yeah, the second deck in my top tier is still Red Black Shadow. I tend to have either a one certain variant of prowess here, or the prowess decks as a group, but now I think that blue-red and mono-red are less popular than Shadow by enough big of a margin that it's correct to just single out Shadow here, and then the rest of the prowess decks will be in the regular section. So Red Black Shadow, it's the best prowess deck in my opinion, because it's very good at killing fast and grinding as well. And it can kill fast with a fairly big creature, so you are somewhat immune to Lightning Bolt and stuff like this, unlike unlike mono-red prowess deck. So as I said, it's important to interact early and often against them, but it's also important to have some plan for their long game with Lurus, recurring Mishra's Bubble, and against Kroxa and other threats of this nature like Cryptic Command and I don't know, whatever else they might play. So you should be able to either close out the game fast, which isn't really the case for blue decks that I'm covering here. So you should be able to, you should have to, or you should be mindful of this, and you should allocate some of your resources to combat this as well. So for example, if you only have one mana leak, you might not want to counter their Swift Spear and take 3 or 4 more damage from it, but then have this mana leak for lures later on, and you will have to manage the Swift Spear other way, for example. It's also very important to be mindful of both Blood Moon and Boil. It's very easy to see if they are having Blood Moon post-board, because if they have Blood Moon, they can't show you lures. So you will know if they have Blood Moon from the start of the game. Boil is a bit trickier. It's not that popular anymore, but it's still something you will encounter somewhat often. So be mindful of it and try to maybe fetch more non-islands. You have to juggle the tension between this and Mystic Sanctuary very, very carefully. For example, when you are playing Stoneblade, you can fetch Temple Garden quite freely, especially if you draw Flooded Grove or Flooded Grove and or Sunken Ruins in Bug, because these filter lands help tremendously against Boil, because you can just fetch your non-islands and still be able to cast your triple blue card. Last tip I have for the matchup in general is to not take unnecessary damage while you are at 20, because then they can't play Scourge for free. So for example, if you have a fetch land in play and you are at 20 and they played like turn 1 discard spell instead of a creature, then don't fetch just because you want to get a tap land. It's better to hold the fetch and to make them unable to play the Scourge of the Skycliffs. Obviously, if you want to cast something, then by all means crack it, but just think about it more than usual. The last deck that I have in the top tier is a newcomer. It's Hammer Time. I don't think the deck is nearly as good as Red, Black, or Omnath, but it's very popular, so I think it warrants its inclusion on this popularity basis. And it's a deck that's good if you don't respect it enough. Like, it's very, very easy to have a 60-65% win rate against the deck, because you can just load up on removals, either in the main deck or in the sideboard, and you will just beat them most of the time. But you have to interact. You have to devote some slots in your 75 to removal if you want to beat Hammer. And Hammer is the main reason why I don't like the blue-green Reclamation deck anymore that I've played quite a fair bit with in the end of December, because you just don't have good means to interact with Hammer. Also, you should try to interact mostly with their equipments, Hammer, and ways to cheat Hammer onto creatures, which is Sigarda's 8 or Pure Steel, and with Lurus, which can generate card advantage. You shouldn't really necessarily focus so much on their dudes, like small creatures that doesn't do anything else, for example, like Memnites and Ornithopters. Stoneforge doesn't do much as well on its own once it's in play. So obviously having early removal is important, but if you only manage to deal with like one of their creatures, they can assemble the combination of Hammer and a creature again. Also, be mindful of Inkmoth Nexus and try to save your Field of Ruins for it if you can afford to. Okay, so let's move on to the regulars, which are, first of all, Back Uro, which is getting a bit more popular. It's not as popular as 4-color, but it's still fairly common to in leagues and in challenges. It is a bit less mid-rangey than the 4-color Omnath, but it's also more reliant on the graveyard. Mostly because it's not as Haymaker oriented as 4 colors, so if you turn off 4 colors graveyard, they can still like Omna View and Our Promise, but back is a bit weaker to this, especially if you present some sort of recurring graveyard hate, for example, Relic of Progenitus or Clothis or Scavenging Goose. So be mindful of that if you are playing the back Uro deck, that your opponent can do this and will do this quite often, so have a plan against Relic or against Clothis. The next deck is Green-White Heliod, which is the creature combo at the moment. The most popular creature combo by far, and the best creature combo by far. Your matchup will be much better if you... Well, much better. I think it will be significantly better if you have the ways to deal with Infinite Life, because then you don't have to care about Spike Feeder combo. You only need to interact with Ballista. So, for example, the best ways to do this is to have Jace the Mind Sculptor or Teferi Hero of Dominaria in your deck. Or if you are playing a non-blue deck, you can, well, not a blue control deck with Planeswalkers, you can, for example, mill them out when you are playing mill, obviously, and stuff like this, which is pretty obvious. But yeah, main point against this deck is have a way to beat Infinite Life and you will be significantly better against them. But you still can lose, obviously, because they are fast, they are resilient, and they have Veil of Summer post-board to beat your interaction. It's also much better to fight against them on the stack than it is with removal spells, because they have ways to protect their creatures from removal. Like, they can put additional counters on Ballista, so you need 2 removals instead of 1 if they go for the combo, or they have Giver of Runes or Spellskate and stuff like this. So it's better to counter their stuff than to get it from off the board with removal spells. Next up is another green-white deck. This is Green-White Titan, which is the Titan deck du jour now. It's less reliant on Titan than Amulet is, I would say, because it also has Eldritch Reclaimer, which is another way to get Field of the Dead going. And this is the main part of their game plan. They are basically a Field of the Dead deck, and if you manage to stop them from get Field of the Dead going, you will usually win the game. They can also kill you with Dryad of Elysian Grove and Valakut, but for example, having a Ensnaring Bridge and removal spell for Dryad is a good strategy versus them. Or just sweeping their board with Terminus and stuff like this. You can also go under them, which is fairly common when you're playing like Stoneblade. They are better against sort of Feast and Famine and Stoneforge Mystic than Amulet was, because they have 4 Path to Exile's main deck that you have to keep in mind, and also they have a main deck Skyclef Apparition to get rid of your sword, which is very, very rude, but that's how it is. Next up are prowess variants other than red-black, and these prowess decks are mostly blue-red prowess and mono-red prowess. They are somewhat similar in strategy, or they are somewhat similar for you when you are facing them as when you are facing red-black, which is you have to remove their threats, and then you have to be mindful of their endgame plan, which is, in case of red-black prowess, it was Lurus and Kroxa. In case of mono-red prowess, it's Obosh and Seasoned Pyromancer. And in blue-red prowess, it's mostly Stormwing Entity and sideboarded Bedlam Reveler or Chandra Torch of Defiance. The blue-red prowess is definitely the least grindy version, but it can also present very fast kills with Sprite Dragons and a lot of prowess creatures, so keep that in mind. The last group of decks I want to highlight in my regular section is Landless Combo, which is it's Belcher and Oops All Spells. The ways to interact with them is mostly through stack, because or via discard spells. But if you have counter magic in your deck, you should be quite okay versus them. They are fast, but also not that good versus hate. Oops is definitely a more fragile of the two, and Belcher can play through hate quite well, but it's a bit slower because of that. Against Oops, it's important to remember that you can kill them with Archmage's Charm. When they mill their deck, they usually have one Nexus of Fate they will shuffle back into their deck, and you can just make them draw 2 with Archmage's Charm to win the game. And also keep in mind that they have path. They not path, but pacts of negation, and or Veil of Summers, but they almost always have pacts of negation, and you should be able to. You should keep that in mind so you can plan ahead for it. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. Then I have my pick for the weekend, which is, to no one's surprise, Banned Stoneblade. This is the list I've played on stream today, which is Friday, 8th of January. And I like it very much. I will attach sideboard guide on Patreon, so you can be ready for whatever you face in Modern, as long as you're facing one of the top most popular archetypes from Goldfish, because that's what I covered in it. And some tips about Stoneblade that I think are important is that mana sequencing in this deck is somewhat, maybe not complicated, but you have different priorities depending on the matchup, because you have to both have mana for Archmage's Charm, which is blue. You have to have 3 islands for Mystic Sanctuary, and you have to have 3 snow permanents for Ice-Fang Coatl. So depending on the matchup, you should prioritize either islands with Sanctuary and Charm, or snowlands for Coatl, depending on whether or not you need Death Touch on Coatl early on. This might be a bit easier once Kaldheim is out, because they will print a tapped snow dual lands that are fetchable, and I will definitely test them in this deck because of Coatl. Also, it's important. Sequencing is in general very important in this deck. I think it rewards tight sequences. For example, there is a neat little trick with Stoneforge Mystic and Batterskull you should be mindful of, which is when you have Batterskull in play and they already get rid of the germ, and you have Stoneforge as well, and you want to get Batterskull back to your hand and put it again into play with Stoneforge, you should first activate Stoneforge Mystic ability and hold priority, and with this ability on the stack, you should bounce your Batterskull. What does it accomplish? Basically, if they have a removal spell for Stoneforge Mystic, you will be able to return Batterskull and then put it again into play, because the Stoneforge Mystic ability is already on the stack. While if you bounce first and then activate Stoneforge, they can kill your Stoneforge Mystic in response to the bounce effect, or the bounce ability of Batterskull. Also, I think it's fairly important to remember that the Niambi Esteemed Speaker, for those of you who don't really know the card, it will appear on the screen right about now. Niambi is a 2/1 creature with flash for a white mana and blue mana, with 2 abilities. One is triggered, one is activated. The triggered ability is when it enters the battlefield, you can bounce another creature you control, and if you do so, you will gain life equal to its converted mana cost. And the activated ability is 1 generic mana, 1 white mana, 1 blue mana, and a tap. You have to discard a legendary card from your hand to draw 2 cards. It's not used very often, but it's especially valuable against graveyard hate that is time sensitive. And what I mean by this is mostly Clothis, God of Destiny, which exiles 1 card in pre-combat main phase of its controller. So it's fairly common, for example, against Ponza, which is the main Clothis deck, that you have Niambi, and you don't want to play the first half of Uro because then they will exile it with Clothis. You wait, in their end step you discard Uro, and then you bring it back on your turn, and they are unable to exile it with Clothis, which is very cool. More general tips about sequencing that I have that are not specific to Stoneblade is to sequence with Sanctuary in two different cases. First is when you draw your card EOT, and the other one is with Planeswalkers. So, for example, if you want to draw a card EOT of Archmage's Charm or Ice-Fang Coatl, while also bringing something back EOT with Sanctuary, you should first fetch the Sanctuary, put the trigger on the stack, targeting the card you desire to bring back, and then you draw a card before you resolve the Sanctuary trigger. What does it accomplish? Basically, if you draw first, then fetch Sanctuary later on, you can draw your only Sanctuary in the deck, and you will be very sad. And if you fetch first and draw later, you might draw something that influences your decision whether or not you want, for example, Cryptic Command on top of your deck, because if you draw another one, maybe you don't want the first copy. So it's very, very minor, but I think it's important to have a tight sequencing here. Similar with Planeswalkers, for example, if you are playing Jace or Teferi, and you have a fetch land ready in the battlefield, for example, you have a 2-mana counter in your hand that you might want to use, but also you don't want to get, for example, Mystic Sanctuary targeting Force of Negation if your Planeswalker doesn't resolve. So what do you want to do if your Planeswalker resolve? You want to use its card drawing ability, hold priority, and with this card drawing ability on the stack, you should fetch and get your Force of Negation on top. So even if they have Lightning Bolt or Assassin's Trophy or what have you, you will be able to get the value of your Planeswalker and put Force on top. Okay, so that's about it regarding tips. The last thing I want to share with you today is my updated backlist. I haven't played back in quite some time, like about 2 or 3 weeks at least. So this is all purely speculative, given how the format adapted. So what I've done since my last time playing back, I've cut 1 Field of Ruin, I've cut 1 Aether Gust, and I've cut 1 Dispel. And something else that I can't really... and 1 Narset. Okay, there we go. And I've added 2 Cliques, 1 Nightpack Ambusher and 1 Collector Oof. Oof is basically a nice hedge against Hammer. If you draw 1 Oof, that's cool. And it will probably be pretty problematic for them to deal with. If you don't want to have Oof that clashes with your engineered explosives, feel free to just add another EE instead of Oof. I think Oof might be a fairly nice card that will surprise them, but EE is also very good in this slot, obviously. And V-Clique and Nightpack Ambusher are basically a concession to Bug being more popular than it was before. So I want to incorporate this more flash creature-y plan against other Uro decks, rather than just relying on Narset. Yep. That's about it. So thank you for watching, obviously. This is my first video, so I probably made a lot of mistakes, and there are a lot of things to shore up in my future videos. Feel free to give me any kind of feedback, both in comments and on Discord. And I will see you next time, and take care.